Everything that you love about medieval or fantasy taverns is embodied in the contemporary American honky tonk. From the music to the bar fights to the barmaids, I'm gonna take you on a journey of the evolution of working class bars in the West. So pour yourself a hornful of mead, or maybe even crack open a Bud Light, and let's get right into it. Taverns have served many seemingly unrelated purposes over the years, which is a reflection of the term itself. Tavern comes from taberna in Latin, which colloquially referred to places like shops, inns, and bars. B's tend to become V's when we adopt words into English, and since English removed gender as a grammatical case, eventually that indicator A falls off the end, leaving us with tavern. For you religion nerds out there, the diminutive form of taberna in Latin was actually tabernaculum, which is also where we get the word tabernacle. All of these words come from the Proto-Italic root tab, which referred to any place of shelter where commerce would happen. Funnily enough, this is also where we get the word tabula or tablet in English, and so when you're putting something on your tab at the tavern, that's where that comes from. That also means that after Moses put the tabs in the tab, he could have swung over to the tab and put some drinks on his tab. Now, the purpose of taverns highly depended upon where you lived and when in time you lived. But I'm primarily going to focus on Northern Europe for this video, because that's the tradition of taverns that made its way into North America, and is also the tradition of taverns that shows up in things like books, movies, and video games. However, there are some great examples of historic taverns from around the world that we just don't have time to get into. In fact, some of the oldest businesses in the world are the ryokans in Japan, which are very similar to a Western tavern but revolve around an onsen bathhouse, many of which have been owned by the same family lines for literal millennia. But let's head back to the frozen north. Taverns served a variety of historic purposes that are very similar to things that the Romans called tabernas. First and foremost, they were a shelter from the road, where travelers could escape everything from wild animals to bandits to nighttime to even the perils of war. In fact, there are all kinds of stories of taverns serving as neutral ground during times of conflict, as well as places of sanctuary where people could go to escape things like violence or the law, as well as structures where soldiers could be housed and fed during their campaigns. But most of the time, taverns operated for peaceful reasons, and were there to serve as a gathering place for both travelers and the communities that they served alike. See, taverns are what we would call a third place in sociology. Unlike your house and work or school, where you kind of have to go, taverns are a third place where you go for things like community, entertainment, personal development, and just overall having a sense of belonging. Things like bathhouses, libraries, gyms, and churches would all count as third places. Yet taverns offered a number of resources that made them especially compelling third places. And affordable food and alcohol is the big one. If you want a place to develop regulars who go there one or more times a week, then you can't let your food become prohibitively expensive. It has to be cheaper than a normal restaurant. Having cheap booze also pretty much guarantees that people will drink more, and so taverns evolved over time to be really good places for politics, resolving interpersonal conflicts, and probably most notably, practicing romance. Everyone hates this, but most people want this. However, this is typically required to get to this, and since alcohol makes this easier, it by extension makes this easier for all consenting parties involved. Speaking of beds, historic taverns also used to offer lodging to travelers, and were basically cheap hotels on top of being bars. Yeah, they probably weren't great places for sleeping, but hey, at least they had real beds, which was something the road couldn't necessarily offer. Over time, taverns stopped offering hotel rooms to travelers, although a fun modern counterexample to this is Little America in Wyoming, and instead started to focus entirely on alcohol sales and live entertainment, which is the other big resource that taverns offer. Live music was historically pretty hard to come by. Learning instruments takes a lot of training and talent, and being a musician requires a recurring audience because you're not selling a product and you basically depend on tips or patrons in order to survive. And so historically, musicians have depended upon venues who are willing to host them and provide them with that recurring audience. And the type of venue that you got heavily depended on the category of music that you were playing. So if you were doing more classical, highbrow music, you were probably going to be performing in something like an opera hall for the wealthy and elite. But taverns, by contrast, notably offered music that appealed to the common man. And so taverns played a massive role historically in developing more working class music genres like folk, the blues, and modern day country, which we will talk about here in a minute. But first, let's discuss how taverns evolved as they transitioned from Northern Europe into North America, because that's going to make connecting these two places a heck of a lot easier. Again, businesses that offer food, lodging, alcohol, and music can be found basically anywhere on Earth. Like, there are literally tavern rules described in the Code of Hammurabi. But we're going to focus on Northern Europe for the sake of both simplicity and because of those taverns' impacts on pop culture. So in Scandinavia, chieftains used to have communal halls or longhouses where they would live, but that people could go visit to do everything like practice politics, worship the gods, or go for celebrations that featured a lot of food and alcohol. These halls were so culturally important that they ended up making their way into the mythology of Germanic peoples, with several Norse afterlife outcomes involving presiding in a specific god's hall until Ragnarok. The most famous afterlife hall being Valhalla, which was presided over by Odin, where half of those who fell in combat, along with some other Germanic kings and heroes, would preside until the eventual twilight of the gods. In our folk imagination, presumably doing things like drinking ale with Valkyries and eating perfectly medium rare meats in the meantime. But once we got into the medieval period, there was a much bigger chasm between rulers and those who were beneath them, and so it just wasn't practical for the King of England to turn the front of his castle into a bar, although that would have been pretty damn British of him. So the longhouse got replaced by the public house, or pub, a term that's still used across the English-speaking world to refer to kind of local dive bars. Also, total aside, but this building makes me absolutely feral. I don't know what it is in like my white bloodstream that makes me glorify the idea of a longhouse, but this really does it for me. What was I talking about? Right. Pubs. So pubs, brew houses, taverns, and inns all technically have their own slight nuances and served different historic purposes, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to refer to all of these different types of similar structures as taverns. And taverns were extremely important to the development of the early United States. By 1733, rum accounted for 80% of all exports out of New England. If you don't know, rum is made by fermenting and then distilling the molasses from sugarcane, and sugarcane was a primary force behind European colonization and the slave trade in North America and the Caribbean. So the manufacturing and sale of alcohol was big business in early America, and it makes sense that the places selling rum locally, namely taverns, would end up becoming pillars of their communities. Taverns were places where businessmen could come to regulate prices, revolutionary militias could be formed, and diverse cultures could interact with one another casually in order to exchange ideas. In fact, the Tun Tavern in Philadelphia is the place where the US Marine Corps held its first enlistment drive, and is considered by some to be the birthplace of Freemasonry in America. There's even a replica of the Tun Tavern inside of the Marine Corps Museum in Virginia. So a lot of famous buildings in early America were taverns, and they continued to serve local communities as a meeting place as the American Empire continued to spread and develop. However, there are a few things that happened historically that put a massive strain on taverns. First and foremost was the elimination of the slave trade, the introduction of non-white immigrant groups into the United States, and the eventual segregation that was forced everywhere in America as a result. And even though taverns tended to be more diverse and more accepting of different people being there, they were no exception to this phenomenon either. And so white bars, black bars, and other types of ethnic saloons started to crop up around the United States as a result, developing their own music and kind of cultural flavor based off of both their geography and the clientele that they were serving. And while racial bars are far less common today than they used to be, there is still a big segregation between bars based on more modern taboos like sexuality and political affiliation, because human beings are nothing if not consistent. Prohibition, which were laws banning alcohol in the early 20th century, also put a massive strain on taverns in America and forced the creation of illegal underground speakeasies for people who were willing to drink illegally, but otherwise put all other forms of taverns out of business. So because of the segregation of patrons and the eventual strain that came from prohibition, taverns were no longer able to serve as the de facto third place for Americans by the time we got to the 1930s. And even once bars were legalized again, they just couldn't do things like host travelers or be places for like business and political meetings. Unless you're in Wisconsin. But there were two things that helped restore bar culture and keep it alive into modern day America. The first thing that happened was, weirdly enough, the advent of the television. Radio and TV made it possible for the public to consume spectator sports without having to physically go to a stadium and pay for a ticket to watch. But consuming sports alone at home is kind of sad, and ironically, trying to watch sports on TV is still pretty prohibitively expensive. So a simple yet elegant solution to this social and financial problem is to simply go to a bar with a television that is live broadcasting spectator sports and to watch with other people. And then the other thing that restored the status of bars in America was actually the craft beer movement. Small local breweries have done a tremendous job of fighting against beer monopolies in the United States. And anytime that you go down the beer aisle of a grocery store in this country, you're gonna find that approximately a quarter of all the beers that you see are local. Because for a whole host of reasons, Americans love to support local alcohol. And I do this too. Whenever I travel, I always pick the beer that claims to be from the city where I'm visiting. I made a point to only stock local beers at my wedding, and I also homebrew myself, which is a pretty beloved hobby of mine. And like, you would be hard pressed to find an American who's willing to consistently shop at, say, a farmer's market for their groceries. But the second that you tell an American that this particular glass of beer was produced by some dude with a beard and an undercut in their hometown, they will pay top dollar for it. And I think that's beautiful. But an interesting historical note is that in spite of segregation and in spite of prohibition destroying the tavern's place as the primary third place in America, is that bars still continue to heavily influence working class culture throughout time. And the impact that bars had on the transition of folk music and culture from Northern Europe into the United States is something that I really want to talk about. So let's start with music. When you think of the tavern setting, you absolutely think about Celtic and Scandinavian folk-inspired music that sounds like what you'd kind of expect out of a medieval setting. The most common instruments in medieval Europe were the fiddle or the violin, which was an evolution of the Greek lyre, the harp, the flute, and the lute, which eventually became the guitar once it made its way into Spain and the American Southwest. English settlers brought a long tradition of ballad songs songs with them into the American colonies, which were low, sentimental songs that focused primarily on feelings like love and loss. However, the Scottish and Irish settlers also brought their own music traditions into the American colonies, which placed a heavy emphasis on dance tunes like jigs and reels. Those songs were mostly performed on string instruments like the fiddle, but started to also adopt instruments like the banjo in the early United States, which was a string instrument that had its origins in Western Africa and was a really common instrument to be brought over by enslaved peoples. Now, generally speaking, early American music was only really blending African and European themes in the rural parts of this country, particularly the South and Appalachia, where white and black musicians were just more likely to interact with one another and were more likely to improvise their styles as opposed to being formally trained by something from Europe. But even though these music styles were blending together, you definitely saw preferences based off if you were in a majority white or black community. Rural African American music developed into things like the blues, spirituals, and work songs, while rural European American music developed into things like bluegrass and other subgenres that became known as hillbilly music. Western swing, string bands, big bands, and jazz bands were some noteworthy crossover genres between the two, and they played a huge role in the development of jazz and blues revival in black communities and what became called country music in white communities. And then both of these sets of genres heavily influenced the development of rock and roll in the 1950s. But something all of these sets of music have in common is that they represent the pain and the emotions of the people who are performing them. Jazz and blues represents the pain of the enslavement and eventual segregation of African Americans. Country music reflects the pain of rural white Americans, who were often forced to do undesirable blue-collar jobs without the social safety nets that people had in the cities. And even contemporary bro country, which is a genre kind of universally hated by urban Americans, still represents the pain of all rural Americans who are watching their communities and their economies disappear before their eyes. And another big thing that these genres all have in common is that they evolved and were perpetuated in bars. Live music is the lifeblood of tavern life, and it's the backdrop that helps people lower their inhibitions, especially when coupled with alcohol, to engage in rowdy behavior or courtship rituals like dancing. Ew, did I just say courtship rituals? I am so sorry. But there's not really a better word to describe it. The European aristocracy had ballrooms for wooing women, and we here in America had dance halls. Dance halls were almost exclusively housed in taverns in America all the way through the 19th century. And the dancing that took place at these taverns was usually an Americanized version of traditional British and French dances. Cotillion became square dancing, the waltz and the foxtrot sped up to match swing bands and eventually became swing dancing. And dancing became a super important part of social life in America. Of course, that also meant that dance halls started to transition out of taverns, especially when we experienced things like Prohibition. For the wealthy and elite, dance halls were often moved into big, fancy hotels. Youth dances started to move into high school gyms, and modern adult dancing in America primarily happens in clubs, which are still technically bars, but are so aesthetically different from the taverns that we've grown to know and love. But that doesn't mean that dances aren't held at taverns anymore. They are. They're just primarily isolated in the American South and Southwest, and typically happen at places like Honky Tonks. And we'll talk about this more here in just a second when we dive into why third places are so important, but I think there's something to be said about the decline of dancing culture in the US and the associated loneliness epidemic that we've all been experiencing. See, without third places, men just don't have a precedent to hang out with their friends anymore after school and or after they get married. And there's not really any good place where you can test out your flirting chops on women either. I met my wife in 2017, so I have had the great fortune of never once being on a dating app. But a lot of my friends in their early 30s are on these apps, and they look miserable. One, because basing compatibility off shared interests is kind of fucking stupid, as any married couple will tell you. And two, because sitting there going, hey, are you up? How are you doing? How was your day? Is one of the least romantic interactions you can have with a person. But approaching somebody at a bar and asking them to dance, now that takes stones, and that is romantic. But unless you live somewhere with a club scene, or unless you had the confidence as a 15-year-old to take advantage of high school dances, then you're kind of SOL when trying to do something like this again as an adult. Which brings us back to the honky tonk. Dive bars with line dancing are basically the only places left in America where you can just show up and hit on single women in a socially acceptable way. And again, I know, everyone hates hitting on people and getting hit on. The fact that I even use the term hit on women probably made a lot of you cringe because we're that repulsed by the idea. But we are biologically hardwired to play this game so that we can get from this to this. And so there's something to be said for having a place where practicing this is socially acceptable. Places like taverns. And it's not just about getting laid either. Prices on food and drink are out of control in this country. Like, I have a decent job and I live in a relatively affordable part of America, but even I can't go out to a conventional restaurant without spending $50 minimum. It is insane. And so my friends and I have actually started spending a lot of our free time at dive bars because they're a place where we can get a hot meal and a couple of beers with good atmosphere without breaking the bank. It's also a place where we can feel integrated into the community and have male camaraderie and just kind of be ourselves for a while without the pressure of work and families, or without the pressure of having to host friends at our own house. Our single friends get the opportunity to ask people out outside of a dating app, and those of us who are married get the chance to do things like dance with our wives, or buy them a drink, or just kind of engage in that form of romance that we haven't really had access to in a long time. There's just something so primal and special about the tavern setting that I think so many of us crave when we're playing games like Skyrim or reading fantasy novels. If human beings have been doing something for thousands of years across all places and cultures, then there's a pretty good chance that it works. And so I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite part of the fantasy setting is, and if there's any third place that you have access to that's able to replicate that feeling for you. Thank you for making it to this point in the video. Please be sure to leave it a like, subscribe if you are new, and I will see you in the next one.